All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another session of the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Dr. Jenny Liu, and I host this particular seminar together with my colleague, Dr. Figliozzi back there. And today we're very happy to welcome Joseph Poirier from Nelson Nygaard up in Seattle. And Joe is a recent grad from UC Berkeley. And he is here to talk about bicycles and business, which is a very exciting topic for most of us here in Portland. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Joe for his presentation.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Joe, and I am a transit planner at Nelson Nygaard in Seattle. But I've also done a good deal of research on the economic impacts of bicycle infrastructure, primarily when I was a graduate student and a little bit after when I worked for a research center at UC Berkeley. And so this is the research that I kind of completed in, I'd say, last summer. And so I'm going to qualify it by saying that there's been actually some good work done since I finished writing this paper and kind of crafting this presentation. So maybe in the question and answer, we can talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done in the past few months, some of the reports that have been released. So bicycles and business success, kind of interesting topic for people who are really interested in bike infrastructure and bike planning. It's very controversial. So this research examines 3 specific corridors in San Francisco. And if any of you are from San Francisco, some of them will probably be super familiar. Outline of the presentation. First, I'm going to go over the goals, why I did this research, why I'm here talking about it. We'll go over the problem statement, sort of what's the point, why is this worth spending time researching and examining. I'll go through the literature review, which I think is one of the more interesting parts of the research. Talk about what's been done before and how this improves on past work. We will talk about the data that I used, and afterwards, it's really great that we're here at a university. I hope we can have a productive conversation about data sources, because that's one of the really challenging elements of bike and economic impact research, is where you get your data. So we'll talk a little bit about the data sources I used, the methodology for the analysis, and then we'll do a conversation about the discussions and the implications of the findings of the research, and hopefully a robust conversation about the shortcomings, because we can always improve upon work like this, and then we'll do questions and comments. So the goals of this research, the goals of this sort of presentation and this ongoing field are, 1, to improve the methodology. This has been done a few times in a few different cities in a few different ways, and everybody's always trying to do it better. And some of the things we have to think about when we're thinking about improving this analytical method is data. What kind of data do we have access to, and how we can use it? That's different in all different geographic contexts. And how can we make this analysis really easy to perform so that people across the country and across the world can carry it out? It shouldn't be the kind of thing that you have to have, say, a graduate degree to do. This should be the kind of thing that high school students or college students can do easily. And how to make the results of this research easy to understand so that we can communicate it to the public. If you're a planning practitioner, it's really, really important that the public can grasp the results of any kind of economic analysis you do, so that they trust the results. And then how can we make it scalable and replicable? One of the hard things about doing any kind of economic impact research is that different states have different laws about what kind of data you can use. Different places have different kind of data available to begin with. So how can we make research like this something that we can do in every city in the US and throughout the world? Okay, so the problem statement. Why does this even matter? Well, if any of you are kind of cued into bike advocacy circles or bike planning, you know that bike lane interventions, I'm going to call them interventions throughout the presentation. It's really just building a bike lane in a city. They're very controversial for a number of reasons, but one of the big reasons is the small business or the large business community often pushes back and says, oh, we're going to lose parking, or this is going to change how customers get to our business. And so our business is going to suffer. And that makes it very controversial because businesses have a lot of political power. So at a municipal level, businesses can they can either derail or they can make a bike lane intervention project successful. Businesses have a lot of power. And there's not a lot of research on this. There's becoming more, and we can talk a little bit about what's been done in the past year. But overall, there's not a tremendous amount of research helping us understand what kind of economic impact we can expect when we build a bike lane. So these are just some headlines taken from the internet. You can find many, many, many of these. If you Google around of merchants opposing bike infrastructure. And this is frustrating for a lot of planners because we want to build bike infrastructure for other reasons, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to help people get places more quickly sometimes. And so when business owners object for economic reasons, it's hard to say, oh, but this is going to be good for the environment, and try to drown out their economic concerns, because those economic concerns are super valid. So literature review. Most of the work that's been done on this subject is survey-based, which means to find out how bikes impact businesses, researchers will go to an area, they'll go to a street where there's been a bike lane intervention, and they'll hand out surveys, and they'll say, oh, you shop at these businesses. How much money do you usually spend here? How do you get here? So you say you get 100 people who drive, and they spend on average $5 at these businesses. You get 100 people who bike, they spend on average $6 at these businesses. These are just made up numbers. But that's how a lot of the research is done. Or it's merchant surveys. So you go to the businesses and you ask them, you say, how do customers get to your store? Oh, how much do you think the average person on a bike spends at your store? How much do you think the average person who takes a train spends at your store? So that's how most of this research has been done in the past. And the field seems to be moving towards, and that survey-based research is very important for a lot of reasons, but the field seems to be moving towards using more hard objective figures, either usually sales tax or credit card data or other sources. And this research that I'm presenting uses another source, and we'll get into that. But primarily the field is using sales tax data. So you get sales tax data from a bunch of businesses along a bike lane corridor, and you use that to try to figure out how the bike lane affected their success. And one of the problems with sales tax data is, not everybody pays sales tax as they should. So a lot of different business types could be you could be missing a lot of sales. Businesses could be underreporting their sales intentionally to not pay taxes. More recently, in Toronto, they've been using credit card data. And so that, that's really interesting. Obviously, there are tons of credit card transactions in every major city throughout the world every day. But as you can imagine, not everybody uses a credit card, and not every business has most of their sales registered through a credit card. So you can say, you might go out to a really fancy restaurant and they might be getting almost all of their sales through a credit card, but the corner bodega might be getting, only 5 to 10% of their sales per credit card, or they might not accept credit cards at all. So that's kind of the hard objective sales figures landscape right now. It's mostly sales tax and credit card data and a little bit of other sources. And when you look at the existing reports and the existing literature on this subject, you'll find that a lot of the research is not very robust. So particularly, there have been a couple municipal DOT reports that have made waves. But if you were to analyze their methodology, if you were to dive deep and say, okay, let me interrogate this, and let me be, not overly inquisitive, but very inquisitive, you'll find that they're not controlling for macroeconomic trends very well, or they're not comparing business success to a higher geography. Some of the better research has been done at universities, and problem with that research is it's often a little bit harder to understand, more verbose, very long reports, 50 or 60 pages, whereas some of the municipal DOT reports, which are less robust in their methodology, have been shorter and easier to understand. So in the literature review I've performed, I really find there are only 2 or 3 reports that have a defensible methodology where you can say, oh, the results from this research are robust enough to be taken seriously. Okay, so in my research in San Francisco, I used kind of a unique data source for this field. It's called NETS. It's the National Establishment Time Series data, and it's a proprietary data source. This company makes it. They purchase information from another company, and they sort of consolidate it and they sell it to researchers. So that's a downside to this data source. It's very expensive. It's about $15,000 for a state. I had access to it because I was working at a research center that had the resources to purchase the data. But it's really, really good data. It has a lot of variables. So, some of the things that are important are it has the sales every year for businesses. It has the number of employees. It has the location. It has the actual address. It has, is this business minority owned? It has the NAICS code, and NAICS code is the classification code for what type of business it is. So it'll say, oh, this is a fish market. It's very specific. This is a fish market. This is a shoe store. This is a salon. This is a credit card processing center. But most importantly, it has the location. It has the physical address, and you can use the physical address to geocode in GIS. And it's relatively accurate. NETS data has been used for a lot of economic impact analyses. And there are a couple good papers that kind of interrogate the accuracy of NETS data, and they found it to be pretty good. The one shortcoming is that when you use it just to analyze 1 year, it's oftentimes less accurate than other data sources. So when you use NETS, you really want to use a period of time. Some of the papers have said, the safe period of time is 3 years. You want to be using NETS data over a period of 3 years. And I also use Google Earth Pro in my research. I don't know how many of you have used Google Earth Pro's historical imagery. It's free, it's amazing, and you can kind of look at an area in a city and then just go back through time, sometimes on a month-by-month basis, and see how the city changed. It's all aerial photography. So you can kind of see right here, I don't know if you can see, this is a picture of the same place in San Francisco from 2004, and this would be, I don't know, October, and there's no Shero here, but then you go to November, and there's a Shero painted on the street. So Google Earth Pro is actually a really awesome tool for all kinds of planning-related activities, and there are other companies that do similar, that have similar services. But I use Google Earth Pro to identify and confirm that bike lane interventions were made when, say, a city report said they were made. Okay, so get into the methodology of the research that I'm presenting today. First thing I needed to do was pick bike lane interventions, so find where these bike lanes were put into major corridors. And then I had to find bike lane interventions that were created within the time period that I had NETS data. So that's 1992 to 2011, which removes some bike lane interventions from the universe of possibility because they were made after 2011. There were a couple really good ones in Oakland, California that I wanted to use that I couldn't because they were in 2015. And I wanted to find bike lane interventions that were done on really dense corridors with lots of businesses, because when you're doing this kind of analysis, if you only have 10, 15 businesses, it's very difficult to draw conclusions from that small a sample size. I mean, that's what some of the research in the past has struggled with, is finding corridors that have tons of businesses on them. But San Francisco is great. It's a super dense city with lots of businesses. So it's a great place to study economic impacts. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Berkeley Bicycle Boulevard network. It's a network of kind of low stress streets that you can bike around, Berkeley on either commuting or doing shopping trips. And it's a really good network, but from 1992 to 2011, there were almost no businesses on it that were there for 3 or more years. Just kind of frustrating, because I thought that would be a great case study. I'm only looking at businesses that were on the bike lane intervention for 2 years before and 2 years after the bike lane was constructed. So that means if a business was only there 2 years before and then went out of business after the bike lane was installed, then that was not counted in the analysis. So these are only permanent establishments, businesses that were there before and after the bike lane was constructed. And that's important because you see the effects of the bike lane on businesses over time, and not so much on the whole area's economic outcomes. And then I dropped outlier businesses. I didn't want to analyze businesses that made more than $50 million a year. Those are pretty big businesses, and they could really throw off the analysis. And then also businesses that had 0 or 1 employees. And so those are kind of, the NETS data reports every business. So if you were making, like beeswax candles in your house to sell at the local farmer's market, you'd have to be incorporated. And that's the kind of thing, you don't really want to be analyzing that business in your data set, because it's not that they're not important, but it's a different type of business, and it might not be affected by a bike lane. And this is kind of an important step, is what businesses you want to include. One of the highly cited papers that does a similar analysis is from New York City. And if you dig into their methodology, they only use street level businesses in a couple NAICS codes, these sort of local type businesses. And so what they're doing is they're only analyzing the economic impacts on a very small subset of businesses. They're not analyzing the economic impacts on, in the New York study, say, gas stations or auto repair shops or furniture stores. So when they present their results, when the New York City DOT presents their results, it's kind of hidden. But what they're really saying is, our results are only applicable to you if you own a coffee shop or a restaurant or a shoe store. So it's this is very important, what businesses you include in your analysis. So I'm including most businesses. Okay, these are the corridors. If any of you are from the Bay Area or have been to the Bay Area, you probably recognize some of them. This is Columbus Ave, so this is kind of downtown financial district of San Francisco. And then this is Fisherman's Wharf. That's kind of a touristy area. And this is a main drag between the two. That's the purple line represents the bike lane intervention, and the yellow area represents the neighborhood around the bike lane intervention. I'll get to that in a second. The black dots are the businesses that were analyzed. This is Valencia Street. This is in the Mission. A lot of you have probably been here. It's a main street. Lots of traffic, lots of businesses. And this is Polk Street. This is north to south, kind of in the center of the city. Again, a main street, lots of traffic, lots of businesses. And you can see down here the number of businesses. This is one of the reasons why it's so good to do this in a really dense urban area, is you get 1,400, 1,200, 900 establishments that you analyze. That's a pretty big sample size, and that's really good. You can feel more confident about your results when you have that many businesses that you're analyzing. Now, the yellow area, that's just census tracts. Part of what I'm doing here is I'm comparing the business success on the bike lane to the success of the businesses all around the bike lane. The hypothesis being that when you build a bike lane on a street, the businesses on the bike lane, directly on the street, are going to have a different economic outcome than the businesses in the neighborhood nearby. So this yellow area is proxying for the neighborhood nearby. It's not perfect by any means, but I think it's a pretty good analysis, pretty good method. So specifically what I've done here is I have taken businesses and broken them down into two separate dichotomies. One is businesses abutting the bike lane and businesses not abutting the bike lane. So those are the businesses in that yellow area on the map. And then I've also broken them down into two groups, all establishments, so all the businesses, regardless of what type they are. So it could be, could be a zoo, could be a movie theater, could be any kind of business. And then I've also broken it down into local serving establishments. And that's what New York City DOT's report did. So that's businesses that are like retail stores, bars, cafes, the kind of businesses that you could probably reasonably expect people to bike to and do some kind of commerce at. So those are the two ways that I broke down businesses. And this is the methodology. And this is a little confusing. I still haven't really come up with a great way to visualize this. So if you have questions or it's not clear, please ask me, because it's kind of crucial to understanding the results. So we're taking two different categories of businesses, all establishments, which are all businesses, and then local serving establishments. So those are kind of the like bars, cafes, retail stores. And for each of those categories, we go into these study areas and we break them down into non-abutting establishments and abutting establishments. So the businesses on the bike lane, and then the businesses in the neighborhood nearby but not on the bike lane. And we compare and look at how those businesses performed on sales per establishment. So that's just the total amount of money that the business is making. and then sales per employee. And when you normalize the results over employee, you're kind of getting a productivity figures. You know, how well is this business doing? The number of employees kind of proxying for the size of the business and their expenses. As you have more employees, it's more expensive. Just because you're making a ton more money, just because your overall sales went up, doesn't necessarily mean you're doing better. Because if you're a restaurant and you're, you know, serving 25 more meals per night, you got to hire more staff. So the sales per employee is more of a productivity measure, and that's something that hasn't been done anywhere else in the research as far as I've seen. So I think that's something that can be done when you have the data, but employee level data is really hard to get. And it's all controlled for inflation. So does that make sense? Like the way the businesses are broken down and compared against each other, compare the non-abutting to the abutting businesses. So I'm just gonna show one of in the interest of time, I'm just gonna show one of the corridors, the results. And these graphs are, I'm gonna use the mouse so that internet people can see. These graphs are 2 years before and 2 years after the bike lane intervention, and then the black line that's the year of the bike lane intervention. And the solid green line, those are the abutting establishments. Those are all the businesses that are on the bike lane. And the dashed line, that's the non-abutting establishments, so the businesses outside of the bike lane, but in that yellow area on the maps. And then the dotted green line, that's all of San Francisco. So that's kind of, we can see how the whole city is doing on these metrics. And this is really important. You want to have these different levels of control. And this is something that a lot of other studies haven't done well. You want to be able to make sure that changes you're seeing aren't changes that are happening to the whole city or that are happening in other neighborhoods or aren't happening in other neighborhoods. So this is for all establishments, these two graphs, and these are just the local serving businesses. So if we look at all businesses, the sales per establishment, they all kind of tracked one another. You see there's not much divergence. They're all kind of going along the same pattern. Same for the average sales per employee. For all establishments, they're kind of tracking one another. There's not a lot of divergence. You know, when San Francisco goes down, so does the Mission at large, and so does the bike lane corridor. The sales per employee all go down kind of together. So it's like, oh, this is happening in the city. It's kind of the general trend. If you look at just the local serving establishments, there we go. If you look at just the local serving establishments, you can see the solid green line, the abutting businesses that are on the bike lane. A year after this bike lane was installed, their sales really jumped, and we can kind of intuit that there's something to that, because the sales in the neighborhood didn't jump up, and the sales in San Francisco didn't jump up, but the sales on the bike lane did. As for sales per employee, they kind of tracked the larger trends. So we've got these tables which kind of cover the graphs, but put it into a percentage change format. A little bit easier for general public, other people to understand, like how different was this, that jump up in the graph? How much was that? So if we look at all businesses, we see that the businesses on the bike lane, they did just a little bit better than the businesses off the bike lane, like 1%, 2%. So I would really consider that a null result. I wouldn't say 2% better. I wouldn't take that to the public and say, oh yeah, the bike lane made businesses nearby do better. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that. It's only 2% higher. A lot of things could account for that. But if you look at the local serving establishments, you can see that the abutting establishments, 38%. That's a pretty big difference. So, you know, at least for local serving businesses, in this one case, they did seem to do a lot better after the bike lane was installed. So overall, when I looked at all three of the study areas, I found that there was really only one strong negative result. One strong negative result here on Columbus Ave. When after the bike lane was installed, businesses on the bike lane did 15% worse than businesses in the neighborhood in the sales per establishment, the overall sales. And there were two strong positive results, one on Valencia and one on Polk Street, where the businesses did a lot better, 20%, 38% than the businesses in the neighborhood. So and the rest of the results, they're pretty close to zero, pretty close to no change. You know, 1 0.09, 4 up and down. Those I would all feel comfortable saying are null results. There's really not a lot of difference. So what do these results mean? We did this analysis, spent a lot of time. Why is this important? What can we tell from it? There's only one really strong negative outcome. And then the two really big positive outcomes were just when we looked at local businesses. So we saw that local businesses, maybe in some instances, see a boost in sales when you put a bike lane into the neighborhood. So one thing that we can tell is there's something going on. There's a difference between how all establishments perform after bike lane interventions and how local serving businesses do. Like, there's definitely a difference there, or just how all establishments perform under any economic condition versus just local serving establishments. So there's definitely a difference there. So that kind of validates, and this is kind of an intuitive thing. I'm sure most of you can imagine that, coffee shops that do well under different conditions than a Home Depot. It's a different clientele. People are buying different things for different reasons. So not all establishments experience bicycle lane interventions in the same way. And the oft repeated by bicycle advocates mantra that, oh, bike lanes are good for business, period, end of story. It's probably not true. I mean, we had one pretty strong negative result. It could not be a valid result, but at least according to this research, that's probably not true. And that's kind of intuitive. If you think about it, I'm sure here in Portland, you could pick a sort of light industrial corridor where there are, I don't know, maybe a tow yard, there's some like appliance stores, maybe an electrical equipment wholesaler. Bike lanes there are probably not going to help those businesses. So this is kind of an intuitive, valid thought process that bike lanes are not good for all businesses. So what are the implications for planners, for professionals? One is that when you're planning bike infrastructure, it's really important to think about the mix of businesses in an area. And again, this seems pretty intuitive. You should be very aware of whether it's a light industrial area, whether it's a mixed use area, whether there's just tons of restaurants and coffee shops on the corridor. These are things that really matter. And when you go out and you engage with stakeholders, you should really know who the stakeholders in the community are. Some of the results from this research are that suggest that maybe it would be a really good idea to put a bike lane through an area that has lots of local serving businesses. So if you have a neighborhood that's got tons of coffee shops and restaurants and retail stores, maybe that community should be asking for bike lanes because their sales would be higher after the bike lane was installed. And then another implication, I think, is more honest advocacy and planning outreach. Is it's not doing you any favors and winning you any friends if you go to a light industrial area and say, we need this bike network. There's actually a great case in Seattle. It's called the missing link. We need this. It's a missing link in our bike network. We really need this. It's going to be good for your business. You're not winning yourself any trust in the community by telling them this is going to be good for their business. In Seattle, it's like a cement plant and a boat building shipyard. And these are the businesses that are fighting back against the bike lane. So, a good strategy there would not be for the planners to say, oh, this is going to be good for your business. And it seems kind of intuitive, but there's I'm admittedly a fairly active bike advocate, and I have been in the past. There's a lot of activity in the advocacy community and the planning community even, where these nuances are kind of glossed over. And the mantra is bikes are good for business, bikes are good for traffic, bikes are good for everything. And that can destroy some of the trust that you win otherwise. So shortcomings of this research, there are plenty, as there are with any research of this type. Self-selection bias, it's hard to say. The mission, where we saw that really positive result, that's like the poster child for gentrification in the United States. I mean, it's hard to say if the bike lane is really responsible for that positive increase in sales, or if it's just the general, positive economic trends that you're seeing in that neighborhood. And I think this research actually does a pretty good job in controlling for that, because it includes Mission Street, which is one major drag to the east. It includes all the businesses on Mission Street. And it includes businesses to the west, which is a little bit kind of wealthier and more upscale. But still, I mean, it's hard to say if the bike lane is responsible for these changes, or if city planners are just putting bike lanes in these neighborhoods because they're doing better to begin with, or worse. Cyclists' travel pattern assumptions. So this research kind of assumes that businesses on the bike lane are going to behave differently than businesses 1 block away. And kind of makes sense, but it could not be true because you can easily see a scenario where someone bikes down the bike lane and then they walk a block with their bike, or they bike, 2 blocks off the bike lane to go to a business. It could not be a really big deal for people to bike 1 block on a street with high stress or no bike infrastructure. So that's an assumption in the research. Net's data error. This, I think, is not as important in this research as it is in other efforts because we're using 5 years of data. So we're really looking at a pretty robust period of time for Net's data. But if you were to use it for, say, 1 year, I think you would want to be a little bit more skeptical of your results. Survival bias. As I mentioned at the beginning of the research, of the presentation, the research only uses businesses that were there for all 5 years. So if a business went out of business after the bike lane was constructed, it's not counted. So, your like a tow truck yard went out of business because the bike lane just made it too difficult for them to get their tow trucks in and out of the yard. I think that's probably a hyperbole, but they wouldn't be counted. If there was on the flip side, if a bike shop opened up in the neighborhood right after the bike lane was installed, because they're like, oh, we got tons of customers now, they wouldn't be counted either. So that's a shortcoming of the research. We only use businesses that were there for all 5 years. And there's no parking data. If you remember, go back to the first slide where I showed all those headlines, like a lot of those merchants were just complaining about parking. They're, oh, you're going to take away parking spaces. This is why we oppose this project. And this research doesn't include counts of parking. So next steps. This type of research has been done in quite a few places. They're doing a lot in Toronto right now. It's been done a few times in San Francisco. It's been done in New York City, maybe in Vancouver, probably a few other places. How can we improve this and make this something that's easily done by not just city planners, but say a citizen scientist or a bike advocate in every city throughout the country? Well, it depends a lot on the data sources that are available. Sales tax data, you can't just get sales tax data in every state. In New York, I think it was pretty difficult for them to get their sales tax data. And there are a lot of barriers to doing this kind of research. But I think that, one takeaway that I'd like to share is that this shouldn't be the kind of thing that you need someone with a graduate degree to do. There shouldn't be this kind of barrier, and it certainly shouldn't be something that you need a graduate degree to understand. And that's another problem with a lot of this research. It's not just the way it's presented, but the methodology used. Like once you get into regression analyses, it's like, how do you communicate that to someone who hasn't studied regressions? It's really complicated. And it's almost not fair to go to a community meeting and present regression analyses. People can't wrap their heads around it, and they can't interrogate it for themselves and say, okay, what are the shortcomings of this research? In what ways could it not be accurate? Yeah, so I think we have time probably for some conversation about how we can improve this, what other data sources are out there, questions, critiques, that kind of stuff. I don't know, how are we doing on time? Is it 12:30? Okay, I'm a little early. So we've got plenty of time. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So if you were to continue in this research, the kind of two questions I have about it. One, would you look at expanding? I mean, you're looking at a relatively focused subset of population here. Would you consider expanding it to other cities, other areas within cities that might not necessarily be geared as well towards existing bike infrastructure? Looking at areas where bike lanes can put in areas further out from the city core that might have a different effect. And then, would you consider looking at, you broke out local businesses as a subset, would you break out all the businesses that you excluded from local businesses as a second subset, since the local businesses always trended positively, the case that discrepancy, might have discrepancy between a highly positive result from the local business versus the kind of lukewarm response on an all establishment level, probably means there was a negative result in the non-local.
Yeah, that's the second point you made. That's a really good point, is breaking out the businesses that are non-local or that you would expect to do poorly. And that's something I didn't do something, maybe you guys can do. And that was one of the major questions I had when I presented this at TRB this year was, why don't you just take the businesses that you would expect to do really poorly and see if that's actually true? Like go to a light industrial area that had a bike lane intervention, see did their sales or their revenues suffer? And I think that's a really interesting question because it would be good to know explicitly who's not doing well. And sorry, the first question, oh yeah, outside of different geographies. So that's really important. All the work that I've referenced, and this work, San Francisco, New York City, Toronto, I mean, these are like the coastal elites of urban areas. They're very specific, very special places. And there's some research happening now, I think, in Indianapolis, and Jenny can probably tell you more about it. But it would be great to get some data and get some analyses on other areas. I think that's really, really important because you can generalize based on findings in San Francisco and New York City, but it's not necessarily fair to say that because a bike lane had a positive impact on businesses in San Francisco that it would in Fresno or Modesto or something. It's not necessarily, that's not apples to apples, it's apples to oranges. So that's another great thing that should be done, yeah.
So you mentioned you have education. I feel like there's some, not a mass exodus, but like after the .com bubble, there were like a whole bunch of people that left the area and other people came in, not necessarily being super wealthy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't look at changes. When I looked at the, it's not in the slide, but in the paper I have, just a general demographic analysis of each study area. But if you look, that's kind of to address your concern of, like everybody's just leaving the city or people are losing their jobs because of the first .com bubble. That's kind of like one of the important reasons why you have the whole San Francisco there as a control area, which just to see is this part of some like macro level trend that's affecting businesses. But yeah, it would be interesting to see how the area has changed over time. If you want, I brought a copy of the paper. If you want afterwards, I can show you. I should have made a slide, the demographics of each area, because I think that's important too. What kind of people live in each area. Does that answer your question? Kind of. Yeah.
Well, what I really find exciting about this is the fact that it seems that it also, when you think about economic boost, it's not just the sales, but it seems to also increase, has a broader impact by increasing the number of employees in those, establishments, because you don't see that increase in sales per employee, so there must be more employees there. Right?
Yeah, that's a really good, I should have done that, but you can use, Nets has that variable, number of employees, and you could have just looked at the number of employees, and the number of jobs is definitely an important metric.
Right, and that's like, wow, cool. And because that means like not only do you get your bang for your bucks, the businesses actually benefit, but the community benefits, right? Means to me, it's like, wow, that's a really profound impact from just writing. But it's still, and I haven't been in San Francisco for a while, but I know Columbus Avenue is really a different beast than the other two corridors. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why you don't see the effect. I mean, it's really a kind of, it divides, it's a total divide where it's located. It's just messy.
Yeah.
What's your thought on why you don't see that effect? Maybe it's something there's about it.
I think that's a good thing to point out. Each one of these is a different type of bike lane, and Valencia Street is a separated bikeway. It's not fully protected, but it's definitely the best or the lowest stress bike infrastructure of the three. So that could be a big reason why we saw the most positive result there. These other two are like mixed, I think it's class 2, class 3 in California, sharrows and bike lanes. So some parts of these corridors, there's not even a bike lane, it's just a sharrow in the street. And that's a pretty high stress cycling environment. So another really good thing to include in this research would be, if you have the data, the average daily bike traffic. Because it's possible they built this bike lane on Columbus Ave and it only like 5 or 6 more people rode on the bike lane every day. It's definitely possible. I would expect it's probably more than that, but that's something that's would be really important to look into too.
Because aren't there also different people, like I just Columbus Avenue, I didn't even like to drive on there. I mean, there's something about Columbus Avenue.
Yeah, so then that brings up the question is why is SF, I think it's, who's in charge? SFMTA is in charge of the streets in San Francisco. Why is SFMTA pushing to put a bike lane on Columbus Ave? And they did like a huge report on Columbus Ave too. I mean, it must have taken thousands of hours of, not thousands, maybe like 100 or so hours of staff time. They put a lot of resources into examining it. You know, if they're making a low stress bike lane, it could potentially have negative economic impacts. That's something that they should be considering. And maybe the community response, if it was negative there, is very valid for a number of reasons. Yes?
Just coming back to the beginning, can you maybe explain when the bike lane was added, what was parking or the travel lane, or what were the cross section, what were the physical changes?
So generally, and that's a really important question, and something that you can get into if you start doing regression analyses, then the downside being very few people can understand them. You could start to add in the number of say bike parking added or the number of car parking removed. In most of these, there's a pretty minimal amount of car parking removed, and that's something that we're kind of seeing as a trend just in general with protected bike lane implementations and other bike lane implementations, is the pushback is so strong that you can't usually end up removing that many parking spaces. One of the analyses that was recently done in Toronto, they only got rid of 10% of the parking spaces, and they were still able to put in protected bike lanes on both sides of Bloor Street. But yeah, on Valencia, it was pretty minimal parking removal, I think maybe near the corners. This is data I don't have, so I'm just trying to remember from what I read in the reports. Pretty minimal, but they also added they gave bus priority, I think, on parts of the streets. They did another good job doing bus priority 1 block over emission. And then these other two corridors, Columbus Ave and Polk Street, I don't think there was very much parking removed at all. Again, it might have been near the intersections to create better visibility at the intersections. But otherwise, they were really trying to still accommodate people who drive while also accommodating people who bike.
Another question. So you said you removed the very small businesses and the very large ones. But someone would say that economic analysis should include the overall economic activity. So why not include total sales along the corridor, including everybody? Because in a way you're measuring, how much is being produced or being done in terms of economic activity. So
yeah.
What would be the pros and cons of doing it this way?
Well, so I think the logic and the assumption is a little shakier for the small businesses, because it could be really important, if somebody is, for example, from my beeswax candle example, if they're making beeswax candles and they can't get their beeswax into their apartment on the second floor on Valencia Ave because they can't park now because the bike lane is too dangerous and they don't feel comfortable crossing the bike lane with bikes zipping down the street. Maybe that's something that should be included. But I think for businesses making more than $50 million a year, I think it's fair to say, not we don't care about how you're affected by this bike lane intervention, but you can probably deal with it if you're having revenues of more than $50 million a year. And B, it's probably a business that's economically active far elsewhere, in like a very, very large geography. So I think it's safe to say it's on the scope and the scale of their operations are so grand that a bike lane probably couldn't have that much of an effect on their outcome. But the effect they could have on the analysis, on the results, is pretty high, because if this is a trucking company headquarters and they made $10 million more a year trucking in the Central Valley, but they just happen to have their office on Columbus Ave in downtown San Francisco, you're not really. It would really throw off your results.
So that's a problem with the data, because then it's including, other kind of, locations. kind of headquarters. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Okay.
yeah. So Nets actually has it's got a variable called HQ, and one of the benefits of Nets is you can use chain businesses, whereas in New York they got rid of all the chain businesses. They couldn't because their sales tax data for whatever reason they had to. New York they had to get rid of every McDonald's and Subway, and so on and so forth because their headquarters was elsewhere. And so you're essentially discounting them and saying we're not measuring the impact on McDonald's, which is maybe fair, maybe not. I don't know how those are set up. Maybe those are franchises. Or to go back to the employee question, if you're having an effect on a business that employs a lot of people locally, that could be important too. But yeah, it's definitely a problem with Nets, and something I tried to deal with by dropping a couple of business types. But I think there's always a way to do it better. Yes.
So the neighborhood area that you have highlighted on here, could you talk a little bit more about that? For example, on Polk Street, why is it kind of the neighborhood you're considering as more to the east side, more blocks than more even distribution? And for example, for Columbus, why is all of the waterfront area all included instead of, I don't know, just
right.
What your rationale is for picking specific.
The rationale was convenience. Those are census tracts, and it was easier to aggregate the businesses by census tract. I think if I did this again, and I think that's most problematic here, I don't think it poses a problem with any on Valencia Street. I think it's actually great because we picked up a ton of businesses on Mission, which is that one street over east. And Polk Street, I don't think it's super important because that area is somewhat homogeneous, like the built environment. But here, I think that could be a problem because you're getting pretty far away from the bike lane, and it might not even be considered this neighborhood anymore. But I think if I did it again, I think it would be better to do a network distance on the road network and buffer by, say, quarter mile or a third of a mile or something. I think that would be a better way to do it. Another control that a lot of other papers use is just a similar corridor elsewhere in the city. And I think that's a good way to do it, but that also has shortcomings. I mean, it is just a totally different neighborhood. In New York, if you're comparing somewhere that's, I don't know, 2 miles away, it might not be a fair control, even if the business mix is similar and the demographics are similar. It's just really far away, and that could be different. But yeah, that's a good question. I think the Columbus Ave area is definitely the most problematic. I would not do it again this way if I did the analysis on it.
I have some questions from our online viewers. So one of the online viewers, Marcio, mentioned that you said that representative, reliable data is really difficult and expensive to obtain. So would it be feasible, you think, to get communities involved and voluntarily provide the data that would be needed for research?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's essentially going back to the survey method, and that's one of the reasons why surveying businesses and surveying shoppers is important, because it's something that you can do. If you can't get sales tax data, or Nets is too expensive, you can't pay whatever, $10,000 for your Nets data, then survey is definitely a good way to go. And it also captures people's feelings about projects, and people's feelings matter too. It's not, you don't have to be totally technocratic about something and say, like, oh, you hated this bike lane, but your sales went up, so we're gonna build the bike lane. So I think survey methodology is totally valid. It has its pros and it has its cons. And if you had a business community that was enthusiastic about gathering the data, that would make it a lot easier. In Toronto, in this recent Bloor Street study, they had 2 business improvement districts, and those are kind of, like they're able to organize businesses a little bit better. So if you have like a business association or a neighborhood business council, that can be really helpful in gathering data. But then you run into reporting error, and businesses do not always report their income the same way to everyone. They might report their income differently to a survey taker than to the government, etc. Yes?
More online questions here. So Jared asked whether you'll continue on with this type of study, and because he states that it might be possible that infrastructure changes like this might not see results until further down the road.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I would like to do more on this. I haven't of late. There's another year of NETS data that's been released, and I don't have access to it anymore because I don't work at the Center for Community Innovation, but maybe the people at the Center for Community, actually they are, the people at the Center for Community Innovation at UC Berkeley are doing a study funded by Caltrans right now using the next iteration of NETS data. So that's kind of exciting. And then what was the second part of the, sorry?
Well, yeah, they were just asking whether you think that the effects will show up.
Oh, show later. Yeah, so I actually don't think that the effects would show up later. I think the effects would be fairly immediate. In New York, they kind of estimated that it's 2 years. If you're not seeing changes after 2 years, you're not going to see the changes. I think it's the kind of thing that would happen fairly quickly after you build the bike lane. You know, people, I'm not sure I'd see a scenario in which, unless the built environment is changing really drastically in a couple of years, and in that case, it's not the bike lane that's causing people to shop somewhere, it's the amount of apartment buildings or the amount of office buildings or something. I don't see a scenario in which people are gonna wait 3 years to find out about a bike lane and then be like, oh, okay, now I'm gonna come shop in this area. I think that's unlikely, but could be totally wrong. Yeah.
I have one more. I just want to say that in general, I like your idea about, you know, when you say that there is an average, to be up or down, but usually that average, there is a distribution, there are winners and losers, and, you know, I think in many cases that's, you know, when people tend to average things out, you know, talk about that, you know, what's going on at extremes. And you mentioned that issue about survival problems, you know, that some businesses go out of business, but then you have the other problem that these changes may attract new businesses. So you have the two things, and it seems to me that, you know, to control and analyze these kind of problems is pretty complicated, but there are so many variables. So I'm really intrigued by what you were saying, that anyone should be able to do this, and it seems to me that once you start thinking about all the variables and all the things that might happen and change over time, it seems very complicated. So I don't know how you square the two things, like you say that anyone should be able to do.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff.
So I think the way I square the two things are, like maybe the way I started doing this research, I was like, oh, I'm going to do regressions. I'm going to put all these things into the regressions, and then I'm going to be able to find out how each thing affects business outcomes. And, you know, I talked to a couple professors at UC Berkeley, and they're like, you know, yeah, you can do that, but how useful will the results be? Like, how much will people trust them, especially in bike infrastructure research where people are very skeptical. And I think everybody should be able to do this, and I think the way we can kind of square that is you can look at this a lot of different ways. You can do it the way I did it. You can look at sales tax data. You can do surveys. And the best thing to do, I think, would be to do a bunch of different methods, and then look at the results from all the different methods and from all the different types of analyses, and see, are they generally are we seeing pretty positive? Is there someone who did a different methodology and came up with like a totally different result? Then we should dig into that and see how they came up to that. But I do think just a general change over time is a good way to do it. It's pretty understandable. Most people can understand, oh, businesses made this much more money, or they did this % better than businesses in the neighborhood. I think that's pretty understandable for the public, whereas the problem with regression analyses is you say like, oh, this variable had this amount of impact, and this variable had this amount of impact, and these are the controls we used. It's a little harder for the public to understand. But one of the good things about the Valencia Street case study is there was also a qualitative analysis done in 2003 by a woman. I think she was a planner at SFMTA. And the qualitative analysis results were pretty similar to these quantitative results that I did. She surveyed merchants, and she didn't survey all the merchants, but of the ones she did, I think she got like 65% saying, oh yeah, this is good for our business. So this goes back to your point of distributions. And that kind of squares with the research I've done, saying that, oh, on Valencia Street, yeah, a lot of businesses maybe did see a boost in sales. So having both, having the objective figures and the qualitative interviews and the surveys, That's pretty interesting. That's a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of effort though. And it also kind of begs the question of, should we be putting this much effort into bike infrastructure when we've got things like multi-billion-dollar transit projects happening in these cities? Maybe the resources are better spent there. Or dealing with things like gentrification and income inequality, which may be like worlds beyond this level of importance. Yes.
That's one final question for you is, so with your presentation, so much emphasis is placed on coming up with results and methodology that is really easily understandable by people just out there in the community. Have you taken your results and kind of engaged in any kind of I don't know, engagement with the community or the business owners or the neighborhoods, and what have been maybe the results of that had happened?
No, that's a great idea. I haven't taken this research to these communities, which is maybe not best practice. They should probably know about this. I don't even think I sent it to business organizations in these areas. That's a pretty good idea. Definitely having active business associations is super helpful for doing this kind of research, and then I think for gauging the community's feedback. But no, I haven't. That's really, I totally should send this to them.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious as to what their responses to that, whether their own experiences kind of match up with what the data has shown in terms of the trends and all of that.
So I can tell you that I have been a part of some bike advocacy in Boston, and the response varies, but a lot of the times the response is, and this is not, I think, an irrational response, the response is fake news, I don't believe your results. And I don't think that's irrational, because a lot of the times you can hide, if you torture the statistics enough, they'll say anything you want, and people are aware of it. People know that, and if people really, really feel, and they have this feeling that this is bad for their business, there's no amount of statistics that can change their mind, and I think that's a valid perspective, and something planners especially should be aware of, which is that just because your numbers say something and the technocracy dictates this outcome, it's not necessarily what you should do for the community. And especially something like a bike lane. I mean, if the business community hates the bike lane, you need the business community to maintain the bike lane. If they're like dumpsters in Oakland on Telegraph Ave, they're putting their dumpsters in the street for the waste removal trucks to come pick them up, because the businesses are so upset. Because the planners in Oakland built this bike lane, and a lot of the businesses don't like it. And maybe it is actually good for their business, but they don't like it, and they feel like they weren't involved in the process, and they don't have this level of trust, and now their dumpsters are in the bike lane, and they're not telling their customers, hey, you can't park there. You can't park in the protected bike lane. That's for people on bikes, because they don't care. So yeah, working with the business community, I think, is really important, and having results that you can trust is really important.
All right, thank you so much.